Okay, so today we're going to continue talking about evolution, and we're going to focus more on agents of evolutionary change. And so what this picture is different species of human malaria. So malaria is caused by a protist. We're going to be talking about protists in 2 weeks. And malaria is caused by protists. And through evolution, we have 5 different species of malaria parasites that can infect us and make us sick, which I just think is really cool. So just a reminder, we have some mechanisms of evolution, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So evolution is a change in allele frequency in a population over time. For those of you who've had lab today or yesterday already, when we're looking at our snails for Darwin, we were looking at changes in phenotype, which we can relate to genotype. For those of you who still have to go to lab, you'll know what I'm talking about either in a few hours or tomorrow. But we're looking at a change in a population over time. And there are certain things that actually cause evolution. One of those is genetic drift, non-random mating, mutations, gene flow, and natural selection. And we're going to spend most of the first part of class today talking about natural selection. If we are in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, then evolution is not happening. For evolution to not be happening, we assume we have a very large population size. We have random mating, so our organisms mate with each other regardless of their phenotype. There's no mutations occurring in our population. There's no migration, so no organisms are coming in or out of our population. And there's no natural selection. But today we're going to focus on mechanisms that actually cause evolution in populations. So the best way to remember natural selection is variation. So we have to have variation in our population. There needs to be differential reproduction. So some organisms will reproduce more than others. And we have to have heredity. So the traits that are being selected for need to be heritable. They need to be able to be passed on to the next generation. If you have those 3 things, you have natural selection. So here's an example of birds in paradise. If you want to learn more about them, there's a pretty cool video. Here's a link to it. But all of these birds live on the same island. And over time, over many generations, they all look very different than each other due to natural selection. So cool example where the birds look real crazy. So there's types of natural selection. There's positive selection, and that's natural selection that increases the frequency of a favorable allele. So if the allele helps you do better in your environment, you're more likely to survive and reproduce. You're more likely to pass that allele on to your offsprings, and so it's more likely to stay in the population. We have negative selection, which is when natural selection decreases the frequency of a deleterious allele. So if that allele makes you unsuited for your environment or not as well suited as the other individuals, you are less likely to survive, you're less likely to reproduce. If you do reproduce, your offspring are less likely to survive. So that trait, that allele, will become less common in the population. And then we have balancing selection. And this is when natural selection keeps an allele at an intermediate frequency in a population. So we're not going to either extreme, we're balancing it in the middle. So if we're thinking about, we have a herd of zebras here. Does anybody know why zebras have stripes? Yeah.
So predators can easily notice when the herd ends, where an individual begins, and each individual begins and ends. So they only see the herd as a total.
Yeah, perfect. So zebras have stripes because it confuses their predators. So when lions or cheetahs or whatever other cool hyenas go to hunt on the African savanna, when these zebras start running, it is very hard for the predators to pick out one individual zebra. And that's how they hunt. These predators pick out one individual and they all attack that one individual together. But when these organisms are running all together in a herd, those stripes confuse the predators and it makes it harder for them to actually get their prey. What kind of selection do you think is acting here? Do you think this is positive selection, negative selection, or balancing selection? Yeah, so we might think that this is an example of positive selection because this stripe allele is staying in our population. Do you have a question?
Couldn't it also be like negative selection for like bad traits that pick out certain ones?
Yes. So this is also, negative selection is also happening in our zebra population. So here's an example of a baby zebra that was born a few months ago in Kenya, and it has spots instead of stripes. What do you think is going to happen to this very adorable baby zebra? It's going to get eaten because it stands out among the crowd. So this is an example for this particular offspring, this baby. It is probably not going to survive to adulthood. It is not going to pass on that particular combination of alleles, and so it will be deleted by natural selection. So that's an example of where we have negative selection happening in the same population where we have positive selection for the stripes. And you can look up, zebras have all different types of fur patterns, but this is just an example that happened recently. So when you hear the word fitness, when you think of somebody that's real fit, what do you think of? Somebody else. What do you guys think of? Well suited to whatever they do. Okay, so if you think of somebody who's fit, healthy, think of these people, right? Like LeBron James, Simone Biles, Cristiano Ronaldo, Katie Ledecky, most of you probably don't know who she is, Manny Pacquiao, Megan Rapinoe. These are all athletes that are at the height of their careers. They are very fit individuals, right? In biology, this is not, oops, too fast. This is not the fitness that we are thinking of. This is incorrect. Actually, 3 of these individuals in these pictures have a 0 fitness in terms of biological fitness. That is because fitness, when we're thinking about it in a biological sense, is the number of surviving descendants produced by an individual. So how many offspring does a person have that survive to reproductive age? That is your fitness. 3 people on that last slide do not have any children, so their fitness is 0 because they have not reproduced at all. 3 other individuals have children, so they have a higher fitness because they have reproduced, they have passed their alleles on to the next generation. The most fit individuals in the population have a fitness of 1 because they're at 100% fitness in the area they're living. The least fit individuals have a fitness of 0 because they have 0 offspring. So if we think of it like this, if you have a lower fitness, like this bird here, they only had 2 offspring and 4 grandchildren, they are less fit than this higher fitness bird that has more children and whose children have more children. So if you are more fit in a biological sense, you are more likely to be passing on your alleles to the next generation. And that's what we care about when we're thinking about biology. Yeah.
So if you're healthy and have kids, you're more likely to have healthy kids?
So if we're thinking, humans are hard when we think about things like that. So the question was, if you're healthy and have more kids, are your kids more likely to be healthy? Because humans have changed their environment so much and we can eat lots of different things that aren't naturally occurring in the environment, for humans, that doesn't necessarily hold true because we have things happening in our environment that might affect our health. Like how I said last class, if you are identical twins, you have the exact same alleles, but if you grow up in a city, you're going to be less healthy than if you grow up in the country. You could think of it if you have identical twins and one only eats fast food all the time and the other one only is a vegetarian. The vegetarian is probably going to be more healthy than the person who's eating fast food all the time. So there are environmental effects that can affect your individual fitness as a person because we do things that aren't natural, like eating cheeseburgers. But if we think about this fitness of this mother, her fitness, because she had this offspring that is less likely to survive to adulthood and less likely to reproduce, her fitness is lower than the other mother zebras in the population who have babies who have stripes. And there's a link to a video. If we have time, we're going to watch it later after I talk about some of these other things. But if we don't get to it, it's a really great video that covers basically everything in natural selection. So we have our first clicker question. Okay, which individual has the greatest fitness? A, an individual that has 12 offspring and 10 of those offspring die before they can reproduce. B, an individual that has 3 offspring and all survive to reproductive age. C, an individual that has 100 offspring and 99 die before they can reproduce. Or D, an individual that has 0 offspring. So which of these individuals is the most fit biologically? So one type of balancing selection is called the heterozygous advantage. And that means that heterozygous individuals have an advantage over homozygous individuals. A really great example when we're thinking about humans is sickle cell disease. So in Africa and in other places in the world, but we're going to focus on Africa for this example, this mosquito and a few others transmit the pathogen malaria. And you can see on this map here, this darker gray area is where malaria is endemic, which is where it is found all the time. It's just there normally. The lighter gray areas are places where there is malaria, but transmission doesn't occur as frequently. When you get malaria, especially if you are a child, you usually get very sick, and over 3 million people die a year because of malaria. It's a very bad disease to get especially if you're a kid or if you're immunocompromised. So people living in these endemic malaria areas have to deal with getting this disease multiple times over the course of their life. So what happened is over time there was a mutation which occurs randomly in red blood cells. This mutation went from having normal hemoglobin to having a sickled cell shape. This sickle cell shape is actually very bad if all of your blood cells have the sickle cell shape because they get stuck in your arteries and veins. The blood cannot move easily and you cannot carry as much oxygen to the rest of your body. So it's not good to have 2 sickle cell alleles, which is recessive, because you get what is called sickle cell anemia, and you are very sick your entire life, you're in a lot of pain, and if you don't get medical treatment, you will die. If you live in a place like this, in Africa where malaria is endemic, getting malaria is very bad for you. It makes you not feel good because you're sick and you might die. But if you have 1 regular red blood cell and 1 recessive sickle cell allele for sickle cells, you have a combination of the normal hemoglobin cell and the sickle cell, which makes you less likely to get sick from the malaria parasite. So in areas where there is a high risk of malaria, having this heterozygote alleles makes you have an advantage. You are more likely to survive and you're more likely to reproduce. If we're in low risk malaria areas, it doesn't matter if you're homozygous dominant or heterozygous, you are going to be a healthy individual. Anytime that you have two recessive sickle cell alleles, you are going to be sick. So that's not a good allele combination to have. But because having this sickle cell allele, just one of them, makes you more likely to survive in areas where there's malaria, that recessive allele stays in the population. So even though it's a bad, deleterious genotype to have the two sickle cells, having only one of those alleles gives you that heterozygote advantage in areas where there's malaria, because you're less likely to get malaria and die. Any questions on this? Okay. Oh, did I forget to take that away? I forgot to take everything out. So, if we're thinking about our heterozygote advantage, if we're thinking about our relative fitness, so who's most likely to reproduce and have offspring that survive to reproductive age to reproduce, if we're thinking about our genotypes, who's going to have the highest fitness? If you're homozygous dominant, you might get malaria, get sick, and die, and not live to reproductive age. So you're going to have a lower fitness. If you have sickle cell anemia, you have two recessive alleles, you're more likely to die from that than you are from getting malaria, so you have the lowest fitness out of these three genotypes. But if you live in an area where there's malaria and you're heterozygous, you have an advantage. You are more likely to survive to reproductive age and reproduce, so you have the highest fitness out of the three genotypes. So that's how you can think of this in a more graphical sense. Any questions? No? Okay. So we have positive selection, negative selection, and balancing selection, and that's what's happening in the environment. And if we think about our organisms, we have forms of natural selection that are these different positive, negative, and balancing selections are going to be affecting these organisms and affecting what their phenotypes look like. So we have three forms of natural selection. The first is directional selection. And directional selection is it selects for one of the two extremes. So it has a direction. It's going in one direction or the other. So if we think about this, if we have lizards with short tails and lizards with long tails, the long wiggly tail looks like a snake and it scares predators. So the lizards with the long wiggly tails are more likely to survive to adulthood and reproduce. When they reproduce, the long wiggly tail, because it's heritable, becomes more common in the population. Short-tailed lizards are getting eaten and die before they can reproduce. So we have a shift from short tails, because they're all eaten, towards longer tails. So we're going from short to long. We're going in a direction. Stabilizing selection maintains the status quo. It acts against the two extremes. So if we think about cats, if you're a short-tailed cat, it messes up your balance. You're not able to jump from trees and land on your feet. But if you're a long-tailed cat, your tail will drag on the ground. It makes it harder for you to catch predators or catch prey in the wild. So having that middle ground of having a long enough tail for good balance, but short enough that it doesn't drag on the ground, will allow you to survive and reproduce, giving you the greatest fitness advantage. So then we have selection for that medium allele, or medium phenotype. So we're stabilizing to the middle. The last form of selection is disruptive selection, and this selects against the extremes. So we're disrupting the middle and we're going to the two extremes. So for example, if we're looking at squirrel tails, short tails help keep predators from catching you on the ground because the predators can't grab your tail as you're running away because you don't have one, it's too short. So that's a good advantage if you're a squirrel living on the ground. If you're a squirrel living in a tree, the longer tail helps you keep balance. So that's good for you if you're a squirrel living in the tree. There's no advantage either on the ground or in the tree for squirrels with medium-sized tails. So that's selected against. And we have a disruption from the median, and we're going out to our two extremes, either short tail or long tail. So those are our three forms of natural selection. We have directional, we're going either to one extreme or the other. Stabilizing, where we're coming to the middle. And disruptive, when we're going to both extremes. So another form of natural selection is sexual selection. And sexual selection promotes traits that increase an individual's access to reproductive opportunities. So it doesn't matter if you're super well adapted to your environment. If you cannot attract a mate, you will not pass on your alleles to the next generation. So your fitness would be 0. So we have two types of sexual selection. The first is intrasexual selection. And this is selection by the opposite sex. So this is an attractiveness trait. So those birds of paradise that I showed you, all those pictures of those different birds on one of those earlier slides, those were all males. This is a male bird of paradise. And you can see these little wisps. They're kind of hard to see, but that's his tail. Those are his tail feathers. It is not helping him fly at all to have little wisps instead of having actual feathers. Here is the female. She has normal tail feathers. She is drab in color, so she blends into her environment. The male has this bright yellow part of his plumage, so it's easier for predators to see him. But because males that are brightly colored and have these funky tail feathers have become attractive to females, these alleles survive in the population because these males are more likely to reproduce with females, even if they don't live quite as long as males that are not brightly colored. Yep.
And that's intra?
That's intra.
Oh, it says interstill. Maybe write that on the guide.
I will fix that on the slides. That is my computer making autocorrections. Thank you. Please tell me whenever I have a typo. Yes, this is intrasexual selection. Intersexual selection is based on competition between members of the same sex. So here we have elephant seals. These are the males. They have this funky nose. That's why they're called elephant seals. These are the females. They don't have that weird funky nose. The males fight against each other for mates. So you can see here they're fighting, they hit each other with their tusks, and this big nose makes them look stronger against other males. And they basically hit each other over and over again, and they get very bloody. You can see all the scar tissue on this larger male. And they will fight the entire breeding season to maintain control of their harem of female seals so that they can breed with these seals. If they lose this battle, they will not get to mate and they will not be able to pass their alleles on to the next generation. So sexual selection, either male versus male, or we have attractiveness going on. And if you want to see some really crazy sexual selection happening, you should watch videos of birds of paradise. The males do all these really crazy dances to attract females. So those are different types of natural selection. But there's other things that are affecting our genetic variation in our population. And one of them is genetic drift. And genetic drift is a random change in allele frequency due to chance. So it just kind of happens. So for example, if there's a rock slide and half of your population gets crushed in the avalanche, that's just by chance. You will now have a different allele frequency in your population because half of your individuals died in a random natural disaster. Doesn't mean that they were better or less adapted to their environment. It just means that they were unlucky. So there's two different ways this can happen. There's the bottleneck effect or the founder effect. And we're going to watch a video by the Amoeba sisters on genetic drift. Where's my mouse? So manatees going endangered or other organisms that are in, other organisms that are endangered, they usually, when we try to reintroduce them, are going through a bottleneck effect. Because if animals are endangered, most of the time it's because we did something to their environment that hurts them. So for example, manatees usually are killed by our boats. And so the random ones that survive, it's not because they're better adapted, it's just because they happen to not be in the way of our boat. And so when we have a small population left, those are the ones that are there that reproduce, and so those are the alleles that get passed on to the next generation. It doesn't mean that they're better adapted or worse adapted. That's also happening with cheetahs in Africa. There's a major bottleneck effect happening with them and rhinos. And what happens, one of the problems with the bottleneck effect is that if there is a deleterious allele in those few individuals that survived, that allele becomes more prominent in the population because that allele is more concentrated because there's less individuals. And so that's one of the issues when we try to reintroduce species that we've endangered, is that a lot of times they have these non-adaptive or bad alleles in their populations. That was a great question. Any other questions? No? Okay. So here are the mechanisms of evolution. We have mutations, which occur randomly. We can have gene flow, which is where organisms go from one group to another. So if these brown beetles somehow are able to get to this population of green beetles, we now have gene flow, so they can mate with each other. We introduced a new allele. We have genetic drift, which is by chance. And we have natural selection, which includes sexual selection, which is an example. Sexual selection is non-random mating.